Thanks very much. That was a great introduction to the issues that we're facing, so thank you for that. I'm also thankful that you mentioned archigram and Peter Cook, who was one of my teachers in the early 90s. I was taught in an architecture school by actually quite a few of the sort of archigram offspring. So in a sense, I come from that tradition. I was kind of shocked by the quote that you gave about the city being a place where you can talk only to the people that you have something to do with, that you're related to. Because of course that's fundamentally not what cities are about. If the invention of if the human invention of the city is anything, it's a way of actually encountering things that you don't know how to relate to. It's about a human institution for encountering other people who you don't share, whose backgrounds you don't necessarily share. It's essentially a kind of framework for heterogeneity, which is a sort of stark contrast, I think, to the sort of rural lifestyle that humans might have. So this idea that we're going to sort of manufacture a city so as to remove all serendipity is kind of an anathema to the kind of work that I'm interested in, because of course, we're entering an age of very complex issues to do with the way we design and build our cities, the way we deal with climate change, the way we deal with social tensions, political issues, socio-political issues, geopolitical issues. And a lot of this complexity comes into direct conflict with a pretty robust Western tradition of rationality and logic. There's all of this messy stuff happening out there, and we seem to want, philosophically, to make sense of it, to turn it into some kind of knowable thing so that we can solve it. And we tend to think that by having more knowledge, it will necessarily lead to more action. This was kind of the Enlightenment idea, that if you knew everything, if you could just see every corner of the universe, if every part of the universe was somehow knowable, we could compute a useful outcome. Which I find interesting, because we've had tens of thousands of reports on all sorts of social and environmental issues. Does that in itself necessarily lead to action? I'd refer to a book called Our Own Metaphor, which was basically the conference proceedings of a conference that took place in 1968. It brought together a bunch of people from a lot of different backgrounds. It was a very small conference. I'm completely blanking on the name. Mary Cathy Bateson. It was Margaret Mead, and it wasn't actually a Macy conference. It was. It had a different name. But the book is by Mary Catherine Bateson. She tried to summarize what took place at that conference. And the funny thing is that all the issues we're talking about today, they were talking about exactly the same things. They were talking about the being on the threshold of being able to do something about this complex interplay between social issues, environmental issues, cultural issues, all these kinds of things. And so, while I do think we can find a way out of this situation, or to sort of construct a positive future, I don't think that it's simply through knowing. It's not simply through measuring every possible point on the planet and thereby somehow encapsulating in a very simplified representation what's going on there so that we can decide what to do. I really don't believe in this idea of ever finer sensor grids, finer resolution sensor grids, even though I am the founder of PatchBay, which is essentially a kind of broker system for dealing with sensor systems. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about PatchBay and actually why I created it, why I first sort of launched it, and then discuss just two or three things that came out of it to try and explain what it is that I'm trying to get to. It's essentially a generalized data broker for the Internet of Things. It is a fairly simple system where you can push and pull data to it basically from anything that you measure. That might be a physical sensor, that might also be simply a measurement that a person has taken. Can I just get that drink? My mouth. I launched it about 4 years ago, and now there are PatchBay feeds pretty much all over the world. And they're measuring all sorts of things, from energy to air quality to biosensors to radiation monitoring, as I'll come to in a second. And there's now, if you'll see, I'll actually try and load this, which is basically a real-time stream of data. This is coming in from around the world, from devices. There's tens of millions of them, of data points coming in every day. I've got too many tabs open right now. Anyway, you get the idea. There is this sort of, there is a flood of information coming in. The question for me is, how does that necessarily lead to doing something about the things that we're measuring? In terms of this Internet of Things, I'd like to take you back just for a second to 1995, 96, when the web was becoming, this sort of exciting new thing. And web browsers, do you remember that experience of the gray background and the blue underlined links? And if you wanted to look at an image, you had to spin up a separate JPEG viewer, and you might have been using the web to follow this academic paper or that academic paper, and occasionally you'd find a researcher's homepage and you'd find, oh, they're also interested in Citroen cars, and oh, he's got a page about that. And then along came Yahoo, which suddenly, it ended up doing a lot of other things. But at the time, what it did that was so amazing, I think, was that it took the very early days of connected things and gave you discoverability on the world beyond. Because it was essentially just a list of links that you might not have realized existed. And so it was through this act of trying to annotate all of these links that suddenly people, I think, I'd like to make the case, were spurred on to more creativity by realizing there are so many other people out there that were doing things that they'd never thought of. And so if you had tried to predict things like collaborative consumption, eBay, Facebook, in 95, 96, even PayPal, which was really only 2 or 3 years away, at that time, I think you would have had a very hard time in the era just before Yahoo. And I'd like to make the case that in the Internet of Things framework, we're at that same stage of the gray screen and the blue underlined links. We have very little idea what's out there, what's actually being made now, the kinds of innovations that are being created. We have no idea what the MySpace of the Internet of Things might possibly be, or the business models that might drive this thing. Because we really are in the very, very early days, even though there's a huge amount out there. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with PatchBay is just provide the discoverability to all of these sort of connected devices, connected communities, and things like that. The other thing is that PatchBay is there to be a platform for just storing and aggregating measurements of things, for collecting evidence, if you will. And one of the periods in PatchBay's evolution that was particularly important for us was just after the tsunami in Japan. Because there had been a Geiger counter on PatchBay basically almost since the beginning. You can see it was feed 397. It was the 397th feed. We now have, 100,000 data streams or so. it had been continuously online since the early days. And straight after the tsunami, when the nuclear crisis was rising, this became the most popular feed on PatchBay. People started looking at this feed because it was basically measuring the radiation. Now, if you read the context of the page describing this feed, you discovered that actually it was in a lab, probably behind a concrete wall. It was in Kyoto, which was hundreds of miles away from Fukushima. And who knows actually which way the Geiger counter was pointing. Essentially, if you look at the graph down here, it was just it was a bit of noise. But people started tweeting this, and they sort of blogged it, and they embedded the graph. And this whole conversation, of course, grew up around trying to make sense of this data, which actually was probably showing very little to do with Fukushima at all. But what this did was it spurred others to say, well, wait a second, let's actually create some Geiger counters, and let's share the information on how to build those Geiger counters so that they push to PatchBay, so that we can actually get a real-time picture of what's going on there. Because at the time, the Japanese government, which was under a lot of pressure to provide this kind of data, because citizens wanted to know what's happening, they were releasing data only once per day. They were releasing it in PDF format, and all they were giving were numbers. They were just sort of saying, well, it's this many microsieverts. In some prefectures, the measurements were taken 80 meters off the ground. In others, it was taken 1 meter off the ground. It was really not terribly useful data. And people wanted to know what's happening actually right now. What's happening near to me? What can I do about it? And so, through the sharing of these tutorials, through the sharing of instructions on how to take off-the-shelf Geiger counters and wire them up, it required a little bit of technical knowledge, not a whole lot. Enough if you were able to use an Arduino, which is an open-source microcontroller used even by high school students. If you could do that, then you could probably get a Geiger counter and plug it into PatchBay. Within about 10 days, there were almost 2,000 feeds across Japan, some of which were updating several times per minute. And so they were measuring radiation in a variety of ways, of course, because in a crowd-created sensor network, the data is necessarily heterogeneous, created by different models. It was created by amateurs in some senses who might well have just been pointing their Geiger counter at the ground rather than in any particular direction. But what was interesting was that because the data was made by people and because it had public visibility, everyone could talk about that. And so you'd find people in the comments or in Twitter saying, well, wait a second, that feed shouldn't be microsieverts, it should be millisieverts. And then the owner could actually say, oh yes, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I'll fix it. You found people discussing the health consequences of these numbers. Wait a second, why is that rising over there, and over there it's decreasing? So the first stage for me was not just the building the devices to measure. The first stage really for me was that conversation that started taking place around the data. What does this actually mean to us? What can we actually do about this? The second stage was when people started to build applications on top of that data to try and help people make sense of what was going on. And this was specifically aimed at people who didn't necessarily have their own Geiger counter. And so this is a real-time map built on the PatchBay feeds created by Haiyan in London, which essentially, because nobody had really discussed the health consequences of the radiation data, all she did was very simply made a sort of color code for whether the current reading was higher than the average background pre-crisis, and then sort of color-coded the scale there. Not making any specific judgment, because of course she didn't have the domain knowledge for it, but simply trying to represent it so that people could then have conversation all about it. And if you go to that page, there is an incredibly long comment thread, people asking and talking about what's going on. Another developer created Winds of Fukushima, which took the radiation readings as well as the wind direction and based on your geolocation, could tell you where the radiation was going to peak next. Now, this data, you should not really ever in a sort of crowdsourced real-time data set, you should not look at any of those individual points and say, aha, I know exactly what's going on there. But what you should do is, A, be able to understand the context in which it was gathered, and secondly, to understand the trend over time or over space in relation to all the other points. Because you're not trying to do the sort of thing that you'll do in a sort of so-called official network, which is to create some implied homogeneity of measurement processes across the entire data set. You're looking for very different things in this kind of data. So pretty soon, others had started to make other applications on top of it. Safecast, for example, started actually making Geiger counters to take to Japan and to sort of use across the country. Others created web forms where if you didn't have a web-connected device, you could simply type in the number at your location and update over time. So this is, for me, an important moment because it reminded me that the idea of extreme connectivity, the idea of these sort of massively connected devices, it's not about connected bloody fridges, you know, the Internet of Things fridge or the toaster or the appliance or the blender or whatever. It's not about efficiency. It's not about trying to build a better public transportation system that's more efficient, that basically erases all serendipity and then tries to remanufacture some illusion of chance. It's not about any of these things. It's about enabling people collectively to try and make sense of something and then do something about it. I'm going to show a project which I built myself on Patch Bay, really to try and understand the kind of things that could come out of this. It's called Natural Fuse. And it's basically a plant with a power socket on it. And the amount of power that's available to the socket is limited by the capacity of the plant to offset its carbon footprint. Now, even one low wattage lamp will not be offset by the plants in the pot. It actually takes 6 of these units to offset the carbon footprint of one low wattage lamp. I mean, that gives you an idea of the carbon footprint of even our smallest devices. So the way this works is that when you take it home, and we've sort of distributed them in cities around the world, you take it home and you switch it on, and when it wakes up, puts on your light, it looks out on the network and looks to see if there were 5 other plants out there that are not currently being used to offset the carbon footprint of the devices. And if there are, then you can safely put on your light, you get as much light as you need, and the community as a whole retains a neutral or even negative carbon footprint. And so you do this by choosing selfless. If, on the other hand, and what happens is that as soon as the community's carbon footprint comes under threat, it'll switch off your lamp for you. So it might be that you only get light for about 20 seconds. You might be able to get it for a couple of minutes. You might even be able to have it on permanently if there are a number of units out there that are not currently being used. And usually there are quite a few devices out there on the network that are not currently being used, so it sort of balances out. Now, if you definitely need to have your light on, you might want to be selfish. And so you put it on selfish, and you get as much juice as you need. Your light goes on. You've heard somebody intruding in your apartment. You want to put the light on. Damn it, you don't want it to go off just the wrong moment. That's great. You get your light. But if you harm the carbon footprint of the community, it sends out a kill signal to kill somebody else's plant. And the idea here is that by being selfish, you're actually removing even more than you think of the carbon capturing capacity of the community, because the community will now be down one plant. Now, in actual fact, what we do is we give each plant 3 lives, a little bit like a video game. And when you get the kill signal, you lose a life, but you also, each of you get an email. You'll get an email that says, hey, you know, this person left their lamp on selfish mode, and it ended up killing one of your lives. And you're CC'd, of course. So the idea is that people can then build up a conversation around, hey, wait a second, what are you doing? Why are you being selfish? Well, look, there was this sound in my apartment and I thought I was being attacked and blah, blah, blah. And so this is about an idea of these physical objects that are sensing something to do with their energy, sensing something to do with their sort of position within the network, and making decisions that are not simply these sort of linear causal relationships. It's not just about a sort of a switch and a light switch. It's a little bit more of a complex situation, and one that has a sort of social dimension to it, because you're sort of necessarily connecting to other people through it. The last thing I want to talk about is actually is this idea of air quality, which we're seeing on Patch Bay a whole lot more of these days. People measuring the air. Now, the question I'd like you to ask yourselves is, for example, in that trash tracking map, or in the cloud that visualizes the air quality, how much does that actually lead to doing something about it? Does it tell you what you should do about it? Let me leave you with that question for a second, because there are these devices in cities around the world that are measuring air quality. They're installed. There must be some in Amsterdam. They might be attached to buildings, or they might be on lampposts. And they are measuring a variety of things. Who knows? You'll probably get a nice little map that shows you the air quality of a particular neighborhood. It's probably color-coded from red to green or something like that. Or if you're lucky and you're in Amsterdam, I suppose it would be yellow to green, because you're probably not that badly off here compared to some other cities. I'm not sure about that. Now, these sensing systems are usually positioned about 3 or 4 meters off the ground, and they're positioned in that way really so that they don't become subject to the maxima, the sudden changes from a truck going by and leaving behind these sort of pools of pollution. Because the purpose of the map that is going to be generated from this is really to give an average across quite a large area, and to give some indication of the neighborhood's air quality. The thing is, though, that for you as an individual citizen to experience anything like what this thing is measuring, you'd have to be up in the trees. That's basically where it's measuring. Don't even know what it's measuring yet, but that map has given me a nice little sort of green, and so if I want to experience that thing that it's telling me, I'd be climbing up on footstools, on ladders and things like that. However, down on the ground, probably where, if you have a child, you've taken him or her in a stroller, that is where the pools of pollution are collecting. And I would put it to you that you're probably going to be way more interested in those maxima that are collecting there, because it's something that affects you directly. And so when it comes to thinking about this, trying to measure the air quality, and I put this in inverted commas because what I want to talk about now is, very briefly, is a workshop that Natalie and I just taught in Barcelona, which we call Qualities of Air, where we developed this map of 3 blocks of Barcelona streets. And it's a pretty fine resolution map. Now, if I told you that this was generated by the XJ735Q air quality sensor that required a couple of technicians to come and measure every single step, that cost is probably about $10,000 a day for 2, call it $20,000. And that the deliverable was essentially this map that gives you some kind of knowledge of what's going on there. Would you trust it? You know, they're professionals. They know what they're doing. They're measuring something that they're telling you is important, and they're telling you to believe these numbers. They're not telling you necessarily what these numbers might lead to in terms of respiratory problems. Here I'm talking about particulate deposition. Would you trust that? What if I told you that actually this map was created by 35 architecture students walking along the street with little napkins and just swiping on horizontal building surfaces and just measuring by eye how much particulate had deposited there, and actually seeing the grime on the napkin and how it varied from building to building, and seeing literally the dirt, the black carbon and dust that is basically building up in their lungs. Would you trust that a little bit more, perhaps? Maybe, maybe not. The important thing is, though, that they trusted it, right? They had gone out and they had measured it. And I tell you, after they measured their street and after they measured their own building where they have to work every day, they're definitely going to do something about that, right? Because every single day, they've got the evidence in front of them. Because what they've done is they've created their own evidence. And that, for me, is one of the most important things about Patch Bay, is some way to amass this evidence and then to compare it with others and to share it and to really try and build up the conversations around it. Interesting it took that moment to do so. A very ominous sound. So, I'm trying to articulate here something that is as much cultural and political as it is technological. I'm trying to get across that there are tools for dealing with the complex situation out there. There are tools for helping us make sense of what's going on. They're not tools for simplifying it, though, right? I think one of the fundamental mistakes that we've made, and here I talk as architects as well as designers, one of the fundamental mistakes we've made over the last few decades, possibly even centuries, is to have this notion that the role of the designer is to simplify, right? There's all this complex stuff out there. We'll simplify it because that'll make it easier for people to understand and do something about it. I think our role is to demonstrate the complexity and help create the tools for managing that complexity, which is different from simply simplifying it. I'm asking you basically to embrace that complexity and to reject the notion of simplicity and to embrace the notion that we can deal with these phenomena by connecting with other people and collaboratively coming up with ways of making sense of the world and then taking action upon it, which is not founded simply on measuring the surface of the planet in ever finer detail and then sitting back totally overawed by the onslaught of data. Thank you.